Well, good afternoon and welcome to this presentation of Heritage Resources Distinguished Lecture Series, and a special welcome to the Burn family and friends of the Burn family. Thank you for coming in. I know some of you have come from a long way away and across water, so it's great to have you here. I'm Elizabeth Jofrian. I'm Director of Heritage Resources here at Western Libraries, and in that role I have the privilege of providing stewardship over the library's special collections, manuscript, rare book collection. So it's a great gig and enjoying it thoroughly. How many of you have visited or utilized or done research with any of the Heritage Resources collections? All right, we're going to get more hands eventually. So for those of you who haven't, Heritage Resources consists of 3 different programs in the libraries. It's special collections where you are right now, and also the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies and the University Archives, which are down on the south side of campus in a building that we share with the State Archives. And so the Distinguished Lecture Series is designed to feature scholarship or collections that are part of one or more of the units of Heritage Resources. So it's a way that we're able to share the scholarship that's happening across Heritage Resources with our communities. And so, again, it's just a pleasure to have you here. In this case, we're going to be hearing from Skye Burn, and she'll be talking about the life and times and work of her mother, Doris Burn, who is a noted children's author and illustrator, and whose papers, through the Burn family, was recently donated to the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies, and also the source of the exhibit out in the hallway out there. So if you didn't get a chance to see that, I encourage you to take some time before you leave and take a look at that. Some upcoming presentations from the Distinguished Lecture Series will include Paul Madison, Western's own Paul Madison. He was with the athletic department for many, many years. He's been engaged in a project called Carver Memories, and he'll be co-presenting with Larry Nielsen, who was a Western alum and the first American to summit Mount Everest without the aid of oxygen. So that's going to be, we haven't set the date yet, I think at this point, but it'll be sometime in late January. So we're going to do things a little bit differently with this particular lecture. Typically, we'll have a presentation, and at the end, we just open it up to the audience for Q&A. But this time, we're going to have sort of a moderated interview, and I'm deeply grateful to my colleague, Sylvia Tag, who's our curator of children's literature here, and that's what these big, cushy chairs are for. So she'll join Skye up here, and they'll have a conversation back and forth about children's literature and about Doris Burn's contribution, but also want to encourage you all to participate in that process, to ask questions, and to get involved. We definitely see this as audience interaction. So instead of me interviewing or introducing Skye, I thought I'd give that honor to Jamie Gansler. Jamie has been with the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies for what now? A little over almost a year? Just this summer? Okay. I don't get out much. Anyway, Jamie is in her second year in the Archives and Records Management program here, and she worked with the center and with Ruth Steele to process the Doris Burn papers, and also co-curated the exhibit out in the hall with Ruth Steele as well. So great thanks to both of you for all of your work to make this happen today. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Jamie, who will introduce Skye, who will then take it away. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to The Strength of a Dream, a Daughter's Portrait of a Northwest children's author. It is my great honor to introduce our distinguished speaker for this evening. As a graduate student intern, I spent this summer learning about an incredible group of people, the Burn and Wernstedt families of Waldron Island in the San Juans. From the surviving records of these families, I read stories about homesteading in the San Juan Islands, exploring the country in a mule-drawn cart and a ballad bungalow, of a Swedish mountaineer exploring the Cascade Mountains, and of a single mother raising 4 children on the shore of magical Waldron Island, pursuing her dream of writing and illustrating children's books by lantern light. Tonight, Doris Burn's daughter has agreed to share with us her memories of her mother and her life growing up on Waldron. Skye Burn, multidimensional artist, author and multidimensional artist, has worked locally and internationally in the domains of art-infused leadership, social artistry, art-based social change, leadership education, and community development. She is co-founder and former director of the Flow Project, a not-for-profit organization offering research and education in art-infused leadership. On the strength of her ideas, Skye was invited to be part of philosophical discussions hosted by the St. Petersburg branch of the Russian Institute for Cultural Research under the auspices of UNESCO, which brought together prominent philosophers, including Jacques Derrida and Jürgen Habermas, humanities scholars, religious leaders, government leaders, and artists from around the world to develop new ways of understanding the dynamic of contemporary culture. As a result of those discussions, Skye was named Associate Member of the UNESCO Chair for Comparative Studies of Spiritual Traditions, their specific cultures, and interreligious dialogues, then based at the Russian Institute for Cultural Research. And she became an honorary board member of the UNESCO Crossings Institute for Conflict-Sensitive Reporting and Transcultural Dialogue, based at the University of Oregon. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our distinguished speaker, Skye Burn.
Thank you, Jamie. Ooh, it's pretty high. Got to get a little bit further back. This speech is in the form of a letter, which I will read aloud. The letter is addressed to my mother, Doris Burn. I hesitate to talk about my mother in absentia, as though she were not in the room. To me, she is present in the photographs, writings, and drawings displayed in the exhibition. I know my mother as I know my own soul. She is part of my identity. I cannot objectify her. Thus, I have decided to bring her spirit into this space through the medium and neglected art of letter writing. When she was alive, Doris Burn enjoyed letter writing and receiving, and happily the Doris Burn collection includes her personal correspondence. As I read the letter, I invite you to sit back and put on your listening caps. Put yourself in a different space. Forget where you are. Sit with your eyes closed or gaze out the window. Let the words pass, mental barriers that we all erect to keep ourselves from going with the flow of information coming from the world around us. Do not watch me as I speak, for I am just a voice. There is no reason for watching me. There will be no drama. There will be no pictures beyond those I conjure up in your heads through my evocation, and no PowerPoint of bulleted concepts, just impressions to take away. Dearest Mother, I am writing you at long last. Life has finally settled down to the point where I have sufficient distance from the events to feel appreciation for the challenges you faced, as well as genuine admiration and gratitude for the choices you made in my upbringing. Only now that I am ensconced in seniorhood am I truly understanding and appreciating the values that informed the choices you made long ago, which have impacted my life no end. Today marks a momentous moment when a tribute to you seems called for. Your memory is being honored in a marvelous exhibition of your work, and I've been invited to give a speech in conjunction with the exhibition. Before telling you what I said in my speech, I need to tell you who is in the room, and a little bit about the space to give you an orientation. It feels like a welcoming space, with windows overlooking Bellingham Bay, sparkling in sunlight, and the Canadian Cascades looming majestically in the distance. I am glad to see welcoming faces as I look out into the audience. Among the faces, a few stand out to me, and I want to acknowledge them by name. Speaking on your behalf, Mother, and on behalf of the Burn family and Doris Burn Legacy LLC, I am taking this opportunity to thank Elizabeth Joffrion, Ruth Steele, and Sylvia Tag, who embraced the idea of a Doris Burn collection and who are the main visionaries, along with Jamie, behind this exhibition. Thank you for giving my mother's work a residing place and for making it available for use as an academic and cultural resource. Thank you for honoring her legacy by keeping interest in her work alive. I also very happily see family, friends, people from the Waldron community. In addition, I sense a need to acknowledge those who are alive in memory only and who are with us in spirit. Please join me in silently welcoming every soul that is present to this space. Mother, in telling your story as I knew it, I started at the beginning and told it chronologically, from the date of your birth, 24th April 1923, to your passing in 2011, using the past tense to impress upon the audience the flitting nature of time. I began by explaining that you were born in Portland, Oregon, to Adele and Lage Wernstedt. I explained Lage was a Swedish aristocrat who immigrated to the United States to attend the newly established Yale School of Forestry. After graduating from Yale, Lage made his living surveying and mapping the mountains in the Cascadia region for the U.S. Forest Service. At age 40, he married Adele Wilcox, who was 20 years younger than he. Adele was called Dottie. When Dottie and Lage met, the Wilcox family was living in Aberdeen, Washington, where her father owned a shingle mill. Dottie and Lage did not have an altogether happy marriage. However, just as Dottie was beginning to make moves toward separation, Lage suffered a severe stroke and was thereafter incapable of talking. You were still a teenager. I remember your father only as a silent dinosaur, hunched in an overstuffed green chair, head silhouetted against the window, sinuous smoke curling through fingers hovered above a plaid fabric-bottomed ashtray with a gold metal trim. Dottie was an important role model for both you and me. After Lage's stroke, he lived 20 years, cared for by Dottie through the prime of her life. She demonstrated what it means to have a backbone, the strength to do what is necessary despite hardships. During hard times, we draw on that strength. When times grew tough for Dottie taking care of Lage, she found the strength to deal with the situation gracefully. She was a true gentlewoman through and through, stalwart, unquestioning of her own strength. You took after her in character traits. Family lore is built of memories, historical vignettes accumulated, burnished like worry stones, passed down through generations. As children, we often heard you rhapsodize about the summer you spent with Loggie in the Cascade Mountains during one of his mapping expeditions. You were 10 years old, riding through the rarefied air on horseback with a string of pack mules. I've often wondered, if your passion for the blue and yellow color combination was evoked by memories of wildflower-strewn mountain meadows beneath limitless azure skies. For your memorial at the Leopold Hotel, we decorated the ballroom with drifts of daffodils and blue Japanese iris. The story of how the Wernstedt and Burn families met is interesting. The two families met through the agency of June Burn, your mother-in-law-to-be. Many people recognize June as the author of Living High, an unconventional autobiography in which June shares stories of the adventures she shared with Farrar, her husband, and elements of her philosophy toward life. You always told me that meeting June awakened your intellect. The Burns' romantic lifestyle sparked a longing in you. I think even then you wanted to marry into the family. I explained to the audience that Farrar Burn was a poet and wandering minstrel. Farrar sang songs of his own composition, accompanying himself with guitar. As an aside, the June and Farrar Burn collection contains his sheet music as well as recordings. The cover of Living High features a photograph of the Burn Ballad Bungalow, a modified Dodge with a stage platform built over the hood, in which the Burns toured the U.S. in the 1920s. In the picture, Farrar is standing on the stage in his minstrel costume with guitar. June stands in the foreground with North and South, your future husband, holding on to handbills and looking a tad disoriented. The Wernstedt and Burn families met in Bellingham, where the Burn Ballad Bungalow tour had ended. On arriving in Bellingham, June and Farrar went into the newspaper business, producing the Puget Sounder, an early environmentalist newspaper that had some influence in the formation of the Olympic National Park. June also worked as a columnist for the Bellingham Herald, though I'm not sure of the timing. The Wernstedt and Burn families connected when June, ever the journalist, interviewed Loggie, who was stationed at Mount Baker National Forest. I gather that interview with Loggie about his work with the U.S. Forest Service started the friendship between your two families. In Bellingham, the Wernstedts and Burns lived within walking distance. Your family lived on Forest Street, next door to the house with the tennis court, while you attended New Whatcom State Normal School. Whenever I walk by Old Main, I picture you skipping along the walkway. The Burns lived up over the hill and down a path on a knoll above where Fairhaven College and Outback are presently located. They lived in two picturesque log cabins, a kitchen cabin and living cabin, that were magically romantic. Ah, Mother, you were such a romantic soul, and your heart responded to the allure of Living High, the unconventional Burn autobiography. When the Puget Sounder went bankrupt during the Great Depression, June and Farrar deeded their property in Bellingham to the printing company to settle debts, and used their remaining funds, $300, to purchase land on Waldron Island, a remote, non-ferry-served island in the San Juan archipelago west of Orcas. Laggy and Dottie bought the parcel next door to the Burns and built a cabin where you spent summers growing up. As children, you and your brother, my father and his brother, and the Chevalier and Granick kids roamed without fear, losing track of time for days on end. A generation later, I found your initials carved in the old madrone in front of the Wernstedt place. And I found in the dune area a lead soldier that your brother cast. You and South Burn were married in Santa Cruz on his return from World War II, during which he commanded a landing craft in the Pacific, and you worked for the phone company as the impersonal, non-digital voice people heard when they called in to check the time. The time is 10:10 and 10 seconds. Buy more war bonds. The time is 10:10 and 20 seconds. Buy more war bonds. The time is 10:10 and 30 seconds. What allowed you to stay focused and live through the monotony of that job? A couple years later, when you and Dad were expecting me, you chose Waldron as the place you would raise your children. Although I was born in St. Luke's Hospital in Bellingham, now the South Hill Apartments, you immediately took me home to Waldron. My first memory of you is seen looking through the hand-carved railing of my crib, seeing you perched on a stool beside the wood cook stove with a cup of coffee, haloed in the soft light. Our first home was a one-room log cabin, which later became a chicken coop. After my brother Mark was born, we moved into a larger log cabin that you and Dad built with peeled Douglas fir logs and beachcomb planks. The only store-bought supplies were fasteners, roof sheathing boards, windows, roll roofing, and mortar for chinking. I remember the roofing bee because Irving French accidentally broke one of the new windows that Dad had just installed when he leaned against a piece of lumber during the lunch break, and it was a joke in the Burn family. In keeping with Burn family homemaking tradition, the new cabin was an organic, compostable domicile erected in the interest of immediate shelter, not posterity. As soon as the cabin was built, it began to decompose. Mahonia and honeysuckle crept through the cracks and the chinking. Rats nested in the fireplace air ducts they scorched when the fires roared. Wrens, swallows, and nuthatches rested on the beams, head-cocked, jet-black bead eyes tracking our movement down below. The uninsulated roof imperfectly shed rain and was not an effective sound barrier between the exterior night sounds, trees soughing, owls hooting, foghorns bellowing, tidal currents rushing, waves crashing, and the interior inhalations and exhalations of the people sleeping in the cabin. At night, after we children went to bed, you worked on drawing. The log walls glistened with the amber richness of a Rembrandt painting, and shadows cast by the kerosene lamplight moved on walls and ceilings as the wick flickered. Your pen nib scratched over the paper's tooth. I heard the sound from my bunk bed. it is not easy to make a living on Waldron Island, and inevitably money became an obstacle. For the first several years after I was born, Dad went fishing in Alaska during the summer. We had crocks of salt cod and salmon during the winter. In 1955, when I was 6, before Lisa was born, you and Dad decided to separate. The plan was for him to live in Seattle, where he could earn money doing carpentry work, while you stayed on the island with the 4 children. You had one request before he left. You wanted to go to New York to discover if you had what it takes to make a living as a children's book author and illustrator. New York was the headquarters for literary agencies and publishers. In preparing for the trip, you created a portfolio of your work to show agents and publishers. There are samples displayed in the exhibition. You borrowed $500 from your good friend Russ Thorson, packed your yellow dress with the pleated skirt, and bundled up the baby, cradling my sister Lisa, who's sitting right there. In your arms, you bid goodbye to me and Mark and Cameron. We stayed on the island with Dad. You went to Seattle and caught the Empire Builder at King Street Station. I imagine the flutter in your breast when the conductor shouted, "All aboard! Eastbound train! Spokane, St. Paul, Minneapolis, Chicago, New York!" The fact that you were setting off on a journey suddenly became real. Years later, you spoke of the forces at work in your psyche during that trip. You were dreadfully torn between missing your 3 children on the island and the excitement of taking your first step toward fulfilling your dream and establishing an independent career and income. You brought a nursing baby with you into your interviews with publishers. You described once, when Lisa cried, your milk let down and leaked down the front of your yellow dress. You vainly tried to hide your wet bodice. Nevertheless, the people with whom you spoke were impressed by your illustrations and sample manuscript. They encouraged you to come up with a stronger story. The idea for Andrew Henry's Meadow came to you when you were pushing Lisa in a baby buggy in Central Park, although it was 9 more years before the book was published. When you and Lisa returned after 3 months in New York, Dad left for Seattle, and you became a single mother of 4 children under 7. Like Dottie, you drew on the strength to do what is necessary in good grace. In all the years I knew you, I never heard you utter a harsh or scolding word. You managed to clothe and feed us on the money Dad sent, $100 to $150 per month. You recited Chaucer while kneading bread in a smoky kitchen without running water or electricity. You managed food safety without refrigeration. You managed doing loads of laundry in a cantankerous Maytag washing machine with a contentious wringer. I remember washing days lugging buckets of water from the well, the odor of single-stroke engine smoke, the smudge of oil across your cheek. Scummy gray water in galvanized tubs. Gradually, all our clothes and sheets turned splotchy gray, except for your dancing clothes, which you washed separately. The island community dances were held in the post office, a log cabin that served as a store during the time when there was an active sandstone quarry on the island. On dance nights, you drove us there to the post office in the clattery old red pickup truck along dirt roads, headlights illuminating the canopy of trees, an owl flying soundlessly. The truck stalled until you stopped and cleared the block fuel line. In the post office, the tables were pushed aside to clear the dance floor. I and the other children lay wrapped in blankets beneath the tables. I watched you twirl, your striped skirt swirling, Chuck's hand cupping the small of your back, supporting the rhythmic dipping in footwork. I lay chin in palms, taking in the rhythmic shadows of dancers cast on the log walls and ceiling by kerosene lamplight, looming shapeshifters. In the background of my consciousness pulsed the muffled generator powering the record player, allowing strains of Hernando's Hideaway, 16 tons, How Much Is That Doggy in the Window, and Tennessee Waltz to fill the room. Between 1956, when you and Lisa returned from New York, and 1965, when Andrew Henry's Meadow was published, your dream of earning a living writing and illustrating books for children was kept in abeyance by the demands of parenting. Yet you kept the dream alive. I remember you in your characteristic pose, perched on a stool next to the Monarch Range, soft light haloing your hair, a still life with coffee cup. As children, when you sat thus, we felt you were absent, unavailable, in another world. Now, with adult hindsight, I understand you were meditating, picturing the book you would write and the illustrations you would create, dreaming the book into existence. Through years ragged with money worry, years of tending the garden and canning, washing diapers by hand, preparing nutritious, low-budget meals, gathering and stacking huge amounts of firewood, through it all, you kept the vision of what you wanted close to your heart and center in your mind. Your love of life and joy in being alive never faded. You laughed and danced and never said a cross word, even as the roof leaked and even when rats ran over your bed at night. Life began opening up for you in 1963, when it came time for me to go to high school. The one-room school on Waldron goes only to 8th grade. Parents of high school students need to make other arrangements. For my freshman year, you and Dad decided that he would return to Waldron, where he could now make a living as a carpenter due to increased population, while you and Lisa and I would live in Bellingham for the school year. We moved into an apartment on Forest Street. You got a job as a lay reader grading papers for high school English classes and took advantage of the proximity of Western Washington University to attend art classes, portrait painting in oils and printmaking. You were working on the illustrations for Andrew Henry's Meadow. I attended Fairhaven Junior High School, and Lisa went to Lowell Elementary. My sophomore year of high school, you returned to Waldron and moved into the long-abandoned Wernstedt cabin, as Dad was now living in the cabin that he and you built and that you had previously occupied. I lived with Uncle North's cabin family in Oakland, California. In 1965, with more children reaching high school age, you and another woman from the island community combined resources and rented a house in the Madrona district of Seattle. When we first moved to Seattle, you earned money teaching Head Start. But within a couple years, you were earning enough writing and illustrating not to need supplemental income. You achieved your dream. You were able to support your children doing what you loved. You ended your career with the publication of Lazy Lizard Canyon when Lisa graduated from high school. Mother, instead of recounting your professional life and duplicating what is in the exhibition, I ended my speech with two stories. The story of your run-in with the head of the children's book department at the University of Washington bookstore, and the story of the final time that you and I were alone together before your passing from this world. When Andrew Henry's Meadow was published, you went to the university bookstore to introduce yourself and make sure they stocked the book. The head of the children's department was patronizing and treated you dismissively. You admitted to a certain perverse pleasure in seeing him forced to revise his assessment of you after you won the Washington Governor's Art Award. The other story is poignant, and I love sharing it with people. Do you remember, I don't expect you do, but do you remember the time when I visited you in the dementia care facility before you moved to the hospital and then into hospice in our home? When I knocked on the door to your room, you answered with a wan look in your eyes and asked, "Do I know you?" I assured you that, "Yes, Mama, you do know me." You invited me into your room, and we sat on your love seat, you at one end and me at the other. There seemed no way for us to communicate. You and I had always communicated verbally, but your dementia meant that words no longer worked. So, without knowing what else to do, I began singing the riddle song, a folk lullaby from the U.S. Appalachian region. You were always very susceptible to music. When I began to sing, your ears perked up. As I continued to sing, you edged closer on the seat. By the end of the riddle song, I was holding my mother in my arms and singing you a lullaby. A cycle came full circle, and I could say goodbye, knowing that we had bridged the gap in the love seat. Thank you, Mother, for a lifetime of memories. I am blessed to be your daughter. Love, Skye.
As was mentioned earlier, this is a conversation, and I hope to get maybe the conversation started, but also really this is a conversation for all of us to participate in. So I hope that as we talk and you have questions of your own and ideas, that we can all just have a conversation back and forth. And certainly, Skye, as you were talking, I know you mentioned that many of the books are listed in the exhibit. I really encourage you to take your time to revisit the exhibit that is here, and also encourage you to take some time to go down to the Center for Pacific Northwest Study. If this has captured your imagination, the original art, the work, the letters is remarkable. And one of the things that happens when we are in the education and teaching side is that we immerse ourselves. And so I did that to prepare a little bit. And so I've just had this wonderful experience of, again, going through these extraordinary, very large pieces of paper. That's what's so remarkable.
Oh, the
is that
drawings.
The drawings, yes. You see, here's this book, but what you maybe don't realize is that the originals are so magnificent and large, and to actually look and see the details of the hashing of the pen, and to see the pencil sketches, which were the very beginning drawings, and then to see some whiteout, some old-fashioned little whiteout, and then the ink drawings that are the final. It's truly remarkable. So I do encourage you to take advantage of the manuscript collection and the letters. The Center for Pacific Northwest Studies is on Bill McDonald Parkway. So if you're coming up Bill McDonald from the Seahome Village, you go up, and then on in that direction, it's on that left side, and you'll see a sign for Archives and Center for Pacific Northwest Studies. And there's parking right there, so it's easy to park. There's a lot you can pull in and go in. And the hours are 8:30 to noon, 1 to 4:30. Right. Yeah. And if you make an appointment ahead of time, that's probably ideal, because the materials are restricted, they're in controlled environment, they're being well cared for,
Yes,
right? And so if you make a call ahead of time, then they can pull materials for you. So, any other questions about that, logistic? Yeah, thank you for asking that, in case people didn't know. So just to get us started a little bit here, I'm a little bit curious about some of the actual living with an artist. Again, seeing those large drawings, I'm thinking, so did you instinctively know as the children to stay clear of the art supplies? Where were those actual materials in this relatively restricted space kept, and how did the...
She kept the drawings on Waldron. She was working on her portfolio, and then she began teaching me drawing when I was 5, and all of her materials, once I learned how to handle them, were available except for her very prized pen nibs. She would not let me use those because they require certain sensitivity with your fingers, and so she wouldn't keep those, but she wouldn't show anybody that I recalled her works in progress. Nobody saw those. And when we lived in Bellingham, she kept them in a portfolio.
Okay.
And in Seattle, she kept them in her bedroom.
Okay. And accumulated the materials and the pens over time and invested in those over time? And
She worked with just the least expensive kind of tools that you could find. That she used a Crockwell pen. There's one, in fact, I think it may be hers. I use it, but there's one in the display, and she used very, very fine nibs, with mostly Crockwell, because you can make a broader and a narrower line as you draw.
And self-taught when she was?
She was largely self-taught.
Okay.
I'm thinking about her so deeply over the last few weeks. To think of her, I think it was not so much that she felt, I really have a gift and it has to come out of me. It's more that she felt, I can do it. I don't know that she ever had a self-doubt around her drawing. It's just something I can do. And I need to make money, and it's something I can do. She was in an odd way a practical person. And living The people who knew her are laughing. Yes.
Yeah. Is anyone else curious about that process? Any? Yeah? Yeah, Laura.
I have a somewhat related question. I'm more familiar with,
Oh, that will be helpful.
there we go. I'm more familiar with the papers of your grandmother, of
June.
of June Burn, and with her letters and her very lively and forthright personality. Whenever I've come upon her letters in unexpected places in the archives, I not only recognize her handwriting, I recognize her very enthusiastic and forthright voice. So what I'm wondering is, was your mother's writing and desire to make a living at writing, was that at all influenced by June Burn's writing and her very real desire to make a living, since her family had those financial struggles too, to some extent due to their unconventional choices in terms of living?
I don't know the answer to the question, but speculating.
Yeah, please.
It seems to me that June inspired Mother to think.
Interesting.
I think that she did not know she had an intellect until she met June. And June embodied a female intellectual, which was something I don't know that Mother had ever encountered before, was a female intellectual. She was also, I don't know that she inspired Mother to write, but June was a superb storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
And in her work, Mother is, in the 3 books that she wrote, I consider her quite a good storyteller. And I think that there may have been some influence around the art of storytelling. But I think that Mother was more convinced she was an illustrator than a
Interesting.
writer.
Interesting.
Because the work she did work also for other authors. Much of her work was doing illustration for other authors.
Interesting.
So those, just to mention those, so the
Thank you.
3 books that, thanks for that question, Laura, wonderful. The 3 books that, and this is again in the exhibit, not to be redundant, but just for our discussion, Andrew Henry's Meadow and Summer Folk and The Tale of Lazy Lizard Canyon were authored and illustrated by Doris Burn. And then she was also hired, we were tired of living in a house, Phipps, right?
Yeah.
My Old Tree, Christina Katerina, 2 books, The Box of the Grand Ballet, Hudden, Dudden, and Donald, which is a Joseph Jacobs folk tale, for those of you know the tradition of Joseph Jacobs, one of the early collectors of folk tales. Tappy, and then When I First Came to This Land, by Oscar Brand, right? So she was indeed hired. And to contextualize a little bit, in children's literature, this adventure to New York City, it was a time when you could go to a publishing house. It's remarkable. And enter and
get
make
feedback.
and get feedback and meet editors, and there wasn't the layers and the people, the gatekeepers so much. And so this idea of heading off with her portfolio was very much a reality of the time, not to minimize the bravery and any, right?
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
remarkable. And I was curious too when you were talking earlier, excuse me, about her self-confidence, that she was self-confident as an author, because her voice is so evident in her stories and in her narratives, these adventurous children. And so here, again, in the context of where the wild things are, and maybe these books coming out where children are allowed to leave their parents, she was doing that herself as a child, as you described in your talk. She was already doing that in her own life, and so it was almost recounting those experiences. Yeah?
Yeah, yeah.
Right?
Yes, exactly.
So
I think that it wasn't that she didn't she had self-confidence in every area because she did have self-doubts that assailed her just like they assail almost everybody, I think. But I don't know that she ever really doubted her ability to produce children's books and illustrate them. I don't know that she ever questioned that.
Yeah. Well, and the stories, for those of you to look at the exhibit and to look at the stories, we're tired of living in a house. The narratives are about children who decide to venture out on their own, and that's repeated. Andrew Henry's Meadow, these stories about children who say, listen, it's not that I have terrible parents, but they just don't really quite get me and understand me, and off I'm going to go, and I'm going to build a community in a meadow, and the other children come and join, right? Andrew Henry, and they each have their own. One little girl arrives with her bird cages because her parents obviously just don't understand her need to keep bird houses in the house, right?
So I like the one with the mud pies myself. She's a cook, and she has this big sheet of mud pies, and she comes to Andrew Henry's Meadow, and he makes her a little house.
Exactly, yeah. Right? And it's really extraordinary. And you can see in the exhibit, but again, the original drawings, to appreciate the amount of detail and work that it takes to actually illustrate with pen and ink this way. It's truly, it's absolutely remarkable. It's exceptional, really. So, yeah, please.
I can do this without. I'm really curious about your family and your mom's. You said you didn't see the drawings. At what point did she ever share the finished books with you?
Oh, as soon as they were published.
And how did she do that? I mean, did you have a little celebration? Did you?
Do you remember?
I don't really remember. I remember boxes of books coming.
No, I don't remember. We were kind of spread out, and she would send copies to her children and her mother. It's her mother's collection that Western now has. They're mostly inscribed to her mother. So
Did she ever read you drafts of the stories? She didn't show you the art in progress, but did she test out the stories?
She would have some of us pose for some of the illustrations. Lisa remembers.
The Jane in the Castle, that's me.
Yeah, the Jane in the Castle is, yes.
That's me leaning over the coffee table. Where I'm dropping flowers off of from the castle in there.
So, and that's interesting because the influences, of course, the Robert McCloskey, for instance, this idea of someone who's not only living an island life, but also draws things in that kind of same Blueberries for Sal. You might recognize that book when you think of. So were you going to the library? Where were these Right, you're on the island and, yeah, please.
So I'm not trying to lead you anywhere with this question.
Okay, I'm going to keep both of them in mind. Is it related?
It's related.
Okay.
Hearing what you've said already about Doe, do you think there were friends or peers that also fed her?
Oh, you asked me that this morning, Susan. Yes, definitely. Your father was one of those. She loved poetry, and he brought her a copy. Paul Glenn, who used to teach at Fairhaven College, and is a painter, and he brought Mother a copy of T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets, and she just swooned over those. But remind me what your question is. And also I think Millie's interest in drawing was of importance to her.
Well, it's related. There's just this sense of influence and this idea of getting here's these where we make connections now and impose those, but was that actually a reality in the time? Not to, again, that behavior that we tend to do is, oh, she must have loved Robert McCloskey. Well, maybe she didn't. She had her own
No,
style. So
Robert McCloskey and Monroe Leaf, the Ferdinand.
Oh,
the
I'm so
biggest
pleased.
there.
Oh.
There were some ones that she felt a great affinity for.
Right.
Both the storytelling and the illustration.
So this is Ferdinand the Bull, if you don't know.
Yeah.
And I pulled this one actually because of the idea of Lazy Lizard Canyon, right? Where there's this sort of alternative gender going on, where here's this soft, sensitive guy who's getting the
I
girl.
never would have put that together,
Right?
Sylvia. That's a good one.
All the other guys are going out in the rodeo, and he's like, "Hey, you go off with your rodeo," and he's off, courting, right? Or William's Doll, or some of these alternative, again, not to impose that retrospectively, but there were some other fabulous things going on. So yeah, and especially the drawings, the drawings, yeah. So.
She would read to the two little kids first around the fireplace at night. And then after they went to bed with their big ears listening, she would read to us big kids, the two of us. And the ones that really stand out in my mind are Endurance, Shackleton's voyage. We all just wept when she finished that. When they
At 1 o'clock in the morning.
yeah, right. We couldn't put it down. And when they all just came down the ice at the end, then we were this. And Tale of Two Cities at the end, when it is a far, far better thing I do now than I've ever done before. It's and a book which I think is probably considered not politically correct, but is The Two Little Savages. That was a pretty influential book. And then she had a constant, oh, you should read this book, you should read that book, and this book, and so led my own sort of curiosity by suggesting books at very interesting times, moments when that can make sense to me now.
That power. Well, certainly the images of children, and I'm curious about your own family life, this sense of, I like to joke about the books that are available for children in the 50s or 40s, and they're How to Build a Birdhouse and the children's books.
We read books from the 19th century.
Well, there you go. Yes, but you have these books, and it's echoed in the stories, the Andrew Henry's Meadow, and in the Summer Folk. And if you look at some of those books, and it talks about how to build a birdhouse, for instance, and the directions are right there, and they're written for the kids. Go get a really big saw, and go and find a big stick, and now, when you look at children's books in 2014 or 16, it's, well, go find a grown-up and hand them the hammer and watch them while they put it's really this inability, there's this fabulous confidence that was for children. And I'm wondering again about your own experience. Was that you had the island to
Well,
run
I think that I was
on and-
handling axes and knives at a very young age. And on an island where there's no medical backup system, you learn to be pretty careful. And if you aren't careful, you figure it out pretty quickly. So it's a different kind of attitude, and children pick it up really quickly. It's not, you just learn that certain things are dangerous.
Well,
And
and
to
that
be careful. Not that you don't use them, you learn to be careful.
Well, and that's evidenced in the stories. When people pick up the books and you read through them, the children are confident in their own abilities to explore and
They
build
are, aren't
things.
they? I
And
hadn't ever thought of that, but they are. There's no questioning of their own imaginations.
capabilities.
Yeah.
It's their and whether it's in your imagination or whether it's real, that's another question for those of you that begin to explore these books. Is this actually? I don't know if you have an opinion about that. If you thought if
Well, no, but where I would be curious is what was going on in the culture that may have suggested some of these themes to her. What
why did she feel they were important or had timeliness? And so, and it's proven to be a bit of a classic. You know, it's still in print, and it's so it's. You know, how did she know to hit it? I don't know.
Well, it's her voice. I mean, that's my sense, is that, again, as you're talking about who she is, it's sort of natural for her to say, well, here's the adults, and the adults aren't cruel, but they are preoccupied with other things, and off the children go with all these capabilities and skills. Were you going to mention something along these lines?
Yeah, this makes me think that, think of when we were kids in the 50s.
Do you
on the
mind?
island,
I don't know.
that,
It would be good for other people to hear this, Chris.
Yeah.
So if you're going to get a
Thanks.
microphone,
Thanks, Caleb. Yeah, sorry.
yes.
hold it close.
When we were little, and I was impressed as a little kid with, Doe was the one of the grown-ups that seemed to think that kids were really people, and who would always be curious, you know, what we were doing, what we were reading, what we wanted to do. Your aspirations were real to her. She was someone who, she believed in us and thought and expected us to do things, or you know, she wanted to know what you were dreaming about, what you wanted to do with your life, and it was so unusual because in those days it seemed like grown-ups didn't talk to kids that way. And she was exceptional. She was my favorite mom on Waldron because she, you know, she just sort of upped your notion of what you might try to do, and believe in yourself.
So I pulled the end of Summer Folk here just to read it to you, because I thought that we could reflect a little bit also on the island, life on the island, as you were just talking about. Here's this community. And Summer Folk is a wonderful story of this tension in some ways between the people who live on the island and the people who come to recreate and entertain. Again, that sort of dynamic between the insiders and the outsiders, right? And the end, at the very end, again, this idea that these children have created all these different, their own community within the community, right? And at the end of the summer, they're all returning, and they've made a flotilla of different creations, and you'll see it again. The exhibit is out. You can look at these books, but there's this wonderful flotilla that's crossing. There's all these broad. Well, that's another topic, but the landscape that she has in her illustrations is extraordinary. Yes, the linear line. Yeah, wonderful. So anyway, we'll get to that, but. So this flotilla started back, and Twilalu's house barge came too, and the sun was low in the west. This time they steered due south for Willie's Landing. Toodaloo, said Federly. Farewell to you, said Rosebud. Stay out of the rain till we meet again, said Cork and Spinner. Au revoir, and many more, said Twilaloo. One by one the summer folk slipped into the tulle grass and disappeared with scarcely a rustle until Willie stood all alone in the tulle grass. Willie felt a little empty, but he felt a little sad. But he didn't let on. So long, said Willie. He allowed that he might come out here and wait around for a spell next summer on the longest day of the year. That evening as the sun went down, Willie and his dad, Joe Pott, sat in front of their shanty on the sand dune. The last of the summer folk were picking their beach umbrellas and zooming away in their fast, fancy boats. Sand fleas, muttered Joe Potts, thick as sand fleas and twice as pesky. Willie squinted his eyes and looked way out to where the sea met the sky. He thought back over things very carefully and scratched his head. Reckon, said Willie, I reckon they're summer folk and summer folk, said Willie Potts, right? Summer folk. So again, this gathering of this connectivity. What I'm curious about, I know your mother loved this book, Summer Folk, and so talk a little bit about that island community, and were people coming and recreating? How was that?
There weren't very many off-islanders who came to Waldron until the 1970s. There was just a little trickle and a few people. But in the 1970s, sort of during the Back to the Land movement, a lot of people began to come to Waldron, an influx. In fact, the school in the late 60s was closed due to the lack of students. And when this influx came, suddenly there were 29 children in the school. So it was large. And as part of that, there was also the feeling of encroachment from, suddenly the islands went from being home to being a tourist destination, but even more so being a very financially valuable property that became sort of a vector for development. So the island community got together and figured out, what do we as a community value and want to conserve, and how can we create legislation or a policy to preserve those values. So there was, in the culture that she was writing from, there was this strong, are the summer people who always seemed like strangers, what are these pressures in our community? And I think that was some of it. And the fact that some of the summer folk, once you get past the fact that they're strangers, are actually quite interesting. And very, one loves them.
Well, and through the connection of the children. Again, this connectivity that happens because it's the children deciding that we're going to bridge the barriers between and create that.
Also, she saw one summer, you were asking about literature about a little bit. She saw us playing. Chris's mother one year read Song of the Andes. I forget who wrote it, but it won the Newbery. And it was the story about Incas in the Andes. And we, all the children, got very inspired. And so we collectively created, all summer, a Inca village in the sand bluffs. And she saw us hauling 1- and 2-man rocks to build a 100-meter pathway to this big ceremonial rock where we were going to hold our ceremonies. And it even had thrones and it had terraces. And Irving French, who broke the window, he's the one who came along. And he said that it was not safe enough for us to play there, and so we stopped. But she saw us time and time again playing in the swamp, building barges, building things. And we'd play in the swamp, and then we'd run down to the beach, and we'd come back and play in the swamp. So she saw children, I think the word is self-organizing, into these, and doing things, creating. We were creating projects that we'd work on all summer long.
And again, the context, I know that Lois Lenski, who wrote Little Otto very early on, and she took it to be published at Oxford, and they originally didn't want to publish it because they said, well, there's no such thing as a children's book without a moral, without a lesson. And this book, Little Otto, is just about a little boy driving his car around. And it was inspired by Lois Lenski's son, who spent hours driving his car around in the floor. And so here was, again, this idea of what your mother was doing, it sounds like, was observing what children love and what is important to them in terms of creating these imaginary worlds and reflecting that. And that's why when people discover these books, they resonate and children want them. They turn into, I was reading a blog, I think just yesterday, and someone was writing and said, we rediscovered Andrew Henry's Meadow, and now it's the book every night that has to be read, and we've been reading it for the last 3 months every night, and that,
I wanted to tell you about the morals, though, because this last drawing in Andrew Henry's Meadow, what is there because the publisher insisted that it needed a non-ambiguous ending. And yet she kept a little bit of the ambiguity. But imagine sometime when you're reading it and you come to the end and you leave that part off, how different that is. That's where she thought she wanted to leave it. But the publisher felt like it needed more of a wrap-up, or more of a conclusion. The grown-ups, yeah. We used to call them drone-ups, because
Well-
they would drone on and on.
Yeah, and this ending is that, I mean, Andrew Henry comes back. All the parents are rejoicing because they finally find their children, because they've all gone off to the meadow and built themselves these wonderful new places to live. And the parents come, and this ending that is being talked about is that the parents finally build Andrew Henry a space in the house. So I
Yes, where
suppose
he
that
can
makes everybody sort of back to being good parents and those sorts of things, yeah. We're about to conclude, unfortunately. This is just, the time has flown. It's been so wonderful. Is there
Thank you,
anything that anyone else wanted to slip in as a question before?
I want to stand up so I can see the people in the back. Susan.
About while Doe was working on Henry's Meadow and money was very short, I happen to know that one year for Christmas presents, the elder kids each got half a ream of white paper.
So the elder kids were given half a ream of white paper for Christmas when money was tight, and that's what the Christmas gift was. Right?
But she was she loved the romance of Christmas. We'd have candles on the tree, real candles, with tinsel coming down. And she would wake up, like, I don't know if she even went to bed, but at 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, we'd have little trees right beside our bed that the children got one little present. And then she would have the whole house lit up with candles and greens that she'd spent all night. We had no idea what it was, well, we knew from the previous year what it would look like, but before we went to bed, nothing was there. When we got up in the morning, it was this magical space.
Well, let's end on the magic of children's literature as well. And I think I can thank you on behalf of the Western Libraries and Heritage Resources, and for not only the gift that your family has given to our holdings, but also for this extraordinary afternoon and your lecture, and congratulations on being our distinguished lecturer.
Thank you, thank you. We will follow up. Thank you all for coming.